All right, we've still got folks coming in, but at a slightly slower rate, and we've got a lot to cover in just an hour, so I'm going to get us started. Thank you so much to everybody for joining us. We've had a huge response to this panel, which I think goes to show how urgent these issues are. And so we have a really incredible panel here. I still can't quite believe we have you all in one space on such short notice to talk about what's been going on. I have plenty of questions ready to go to guide us through this discussion, but for the folks in our audience, our question and answer function is live. So please feel free to share any questions that you have throughout the conversation, and we'll get to as many as we can towards the end of our hour. So I'm just going to kick it off really quickly by setting the stage before I have our panelists introduce themselves. Over the past 3 weeks, we've watched an unelected billionaire, Elon Musk, repeatedly demand and be granted access to agencies across the federal government. A number of people who seem to be working for him under the umbrella of the so-called Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE, have also gained access to federal buildings, data, and technical systems, including at the Department of Treasury, the Departments of Labor and Education, USAID, most recently the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, and others. Musk has made threats about shutting some of those agencies down, has reportedly moved to shut off funding streams appropriated by Congress, and federal workers have been refused access to their offices and even put on administrative leave. We've also seen in the past week and a half, members of Congress turned away from federal buildings where DOGE employees have been granted access. And Musk has also called reporters covering this story criminal. So today we're going to talk through what exactly has been happening, what the risks are, particularly in the context of data security, who is challenging these actions and how, and get into a little bit of what we can expect to happen next. So I'm going to kick it now to our luminaries on the panel. And if each of you could start just by introducing yourself and giving a brief overview of how you're engaged in this work over the past few weeks, that would be great. And I'm just going to kind of name you on the order you are on my screen. So that's Victoria, and then John and Lisa.
Hi, I'm Victoria Elliott. I am sick today, so I'm sorry. But I am a reporter with Wired. I cover tech platforms and their impact on society, and now the sort of merger of the industry with government.
Hi, all. Thank you so much to Jenna and to Free Press and to my fellow panelists. I'm John Davison, Director of Litigation at the Electronic Privacy Information Center, or EPIC. We're a nonprofit public interest research center based in Washington. We were established in 1994 to focus public attention on emerging privacy and civil liberties issues. A key part of our mission is oversight of government activities and collections of personal data that impact personal freedoms, individual privacy, and democratic values. So you can imagine that the events of the past couple of weeks have been of great interest to us and to EPIC's members. And we have been emphasizing a point that was made in the description of this event, that this is the largest and most consequential breach of personal information in US history. And it's being led by malign, unaccountable forces from both without and within government, an alliance of plutocrats and trolls and anti-government crusaders and sadistic or oblivious tech bros. So since the first rumblings of these database, hijackings first broke, we have been sounding the alarm along with many others in civil society and the press and elsewhere about the privacy, the security, and the democratic governance implications of all this. Thanks.
Thanks, Jenna. Thanks, Free Press. Let me add my congrats for pulling together such a great event. Really excited to be here with all of you. So I'm Lisa Gilbert, co-president of Public Citizen. Public Citizen has been around for 54 years. We represent 500,000 members and supporters, and our mission is to take on corporate power on behalf of regular people. We're multi-issue. We work on democracy, the economy, the environment, healthcare, tech policy, and more. And tactically, we litigate, advocate, do messaging and organizing work. So connected to our mission, we've of course been really focused on pushing back on Doge directly as just the epitome of a corporate corrupt power grab. To that end, we were the very first suit of the Trump era out of the gates. We sued moments after he was sworn in. On the likely illegal structure of Doge. And then since then, we filed suits on behalf of plaintiffs at both Treasury and Department of Education around access to personal and financial information of Americans as a violation of just core privacy law. And we're also taking on a set of the stop work orders and agency disillusions that have been pushed for by Doge. Beyond litigation, we're also front and center in the framing of Musk as a villain. We led a letter from 160 organizations with the National Women's Law Center to the Hill, talking about the need to hold Musk accountable as he and Doge run rampant through government. And we've also done polling and message testing focused on Doge, and I'll talk more about that later.
Amazing. And my name is Jenna Ruddick. I'm the advocacy director at Free Press. And I focus in particular on our work around surveillance, digital civil rights, and tech accountability, which is why I'm so excited that we can have this panel here today, all of whom I've been lucky to work with and whose work I've followed for a long time. And we're just going to dive right into this, and I'm going to kick it first to John to start us off by giving folks a sense of what's at stake here when it comes to data in particular. Even as someone who thinks a lot about data and control and surveillance, it's still really hard to convey and sometimes even wrap my own head around exactly how much data we're talking about here, what kinds of data, and what can be done with that data. I also think we're all generally aware that there is a lot of data on each of us that's out there in circulation in general. So if you could talk a bit about why what's happening here is so uniquely alarming and unprecedented.
Sure. And yeah, like you, Jenna, it's hard to know where to begin because there is so much at stake. I'll start by keying in on two agencies in particular that Epic has keyed in on, the Treasury Department and the Office of Personnel Management. There are certainly other agencies that are implicated in this cross-agency assault, but I'll focus on those to start. As I imagine many of you are aware that one of the key organs of the Treasury Department is the Bureau of the Fiscal Service. Many of us probably had never heard of it, including myself, until a few weeks ago. It is part of the government that controls the federal payment system that distributes, it's a very high percentage, something like 90% of federal payments, including Social Security benefits, tax refunds, vendor payments. The systems process something like $6 trillion a year and are responsible for more than 1 billion payments annually. And that unit of the Treasury Department controls several dozen interconnected databases and systems to carry out its work. And these systems implicate immense volumes of sensitive personal data, everything from Social Security numbers to tax information. Just to take one system, as I say, there are several dozen, but to look at one of these in particular, I want to read off the list of data elements that's in this system because it'll sort of underscore just how sensitive and extensive a system we're talking about. Social Security numbers, personal taxpayer identification numbers, personal financial information, taxpayer information, return information, date of birth, address, zip code, phone number, email address, marital status, spousal information, information on children, mother's maiden names, military service information, employee identification numbers, health plan beneficiary numbers, patient ID numbers, file case ID numbers, medical health information, mental health information, workers' compensation information, disability information, and emergency contact information. And that is one database out of several dozen. So we're talking about huge volumes of personal data from a pretty substantial percentage of all Americans. And then over at OPM, we're talking about databases and in particular one warehouse that's part of the enterprise human resources integration that houses still other types of records pertaining to a high percentage of current and former federal employees. So that's yet another sensitive data set containing things like job descriptions and job records, disciplinary actions, salaries, contact information, and so forth. And ordinarily, these systems are operated by career civil servants without direct involvement by political personnel. They are protected by an imperfect but still quite robust set of information security and privacy and confidentiality protections. And I'm sure we'll get into more of those later. But what we're seeing now blows past all of that and really puts those systems at tremendous risk in a number of different ways. And I look at this in three buckets. The first is what we understand as privacy harms from wrongful disclosure of personal information. And all of these are to some degree privacy harms, but things like the being deprived of control and protection over your personal data held in a government data system that violates the constitutional right to information privacy. It is a privacy harm in its own right simply to have that information disclosed to someone who doesn't have a lawful basis to access it. But then there's the consequential harms that can flow from wrongful disclosure, especially if you no longer have faith that the data remains only in the original system. So identity theft, sales to data brokers, endangerment to physical safety, stalking and harassment and doxing, blackmail, which is a major concern when we're talking about government personnel, especially, presents many risks, including national security risks. And these risks may come both from within this sort of hijacked government or from without if it is leaking to other sources, including, for example, Elon Musk and his companies. That second bucket, there are risks to the market from competition that come from a plutocrat having, with all of these business interests, gaining direct access to sensitive information that would provide a competitive advantage and provide avenues to avoid enforcement to the extent that the federal government will be doing enforcement anymore. And then maybe the biggest risk of all is sort of the risk to democratic government. The folks involved here, these bandits, these hijackers, have correctly assessed that these systems in federal agencies are really critical levers for how they carry out the functions that Congress has assigned to them as agencies. And so the breach of that data empowers unaccountable people to work all sorts of harms and exert all sorts of pressure on federal employees, on the public at large, on people they disagree with politically. And that is something we should be, of course, very, very worried about.
And Lisa and Victoria, I want to give you a chance to jump in here if you'd like before we move on to that question of kind of who these people are, as John raised.
Yeah, thanks so much. And John, that was a great summary. Completely agree with everything you had to say. I guess maybe just to underscore, I think this was your second bucket when you were talking about the risks of Musk, having access as well as his unqualified minions. I think what really stands out to me is the corruption implicit in Musk being at the helm of Doge, just the potential huge personal benefits. We did a report back in October and found that just 3 of Musk's businesses faced at least 11 criminal and civil investigations right now. In addition, Musk benefits from huge amounts of government contracts. SpaceX likely to accrue another $20 billion in federal business between now and 2028, almost $6 billion a year. Just the ability he has to change funding going to his competitors, potentially through the misuse of the Treasury data, or to preference, his new Visa X payments system. Just, this is so problematic and so ethically challenging. It's just a core concern. So something we're paying a lot of attention to a public citizen, and I think also something that's really resonating with regular Americans as a part of the problem.
And I think that, oh, Victoria, go ahead.
I mean, I think John did a great job of breaking down why this is so concerning, probably better than I've done in any interview, because I think it's hard when you're in the weeds. So 10 out of 10 should always be replaying that clip of what data is actually in there. But I think, as I've said, one of the biggest issues is the lack of transparency. Even if these people are extraordinarily technically gifted, which Musk says they are, and they seem to be, one of them was a senior at Harvard while running a startup. Another one, I'm sorry, again, ill. One of them, used AI to do translation on an ancient scroll that otherwise had not been deciphered. I think that's like really beautiful. And even if they are really technically gifted and perfect in pure in intention, the reality still stands that, we don't know what systems they're accessing. We are not being given transparency about their roles. And as anyone who's ever had a new job will tell you, like, you can't just go in and change everything. You don't know the system yet. You don't know the protocols. You don't know the policies. You don't know why something is like this. And so, again, even if these were extraordinarily technically gifted people with nothing but pure intentions, the idea that they're going into these systems and possibly changing them or extracting data from them, and knowing that they would not have had access to this before January 20th. So basically with 3 weeks of knowledge, I think is the thing that is so scary, because the consequences for getting it wrong are so dire for so many people.
And I think sticking on that point of kind of who is involved with this and also Musk's own entanglement, Victoria, I was going to kick it to you next. You and your colleagues at Wired have been breaking story after story these past few weeks, but you've also been reporting on Musk long before the election even. I was looking back at some of your stories right around the election, and you wrote in November that there's no reason to doubt that Musk will seek to ensure that everything he's posting about now comes to pass. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how your earlier reporting on Musk, his ideologies, and his kind of specific tech cohort, which includes Peter Thiel and Trump's so-called crypto czar, David Sachs, kind of how that's informed your work in this moment.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing that was the single most informative thing was covering his purchase of Twitter in 2022. He did exactly what he said he was going to do, which is why I've been very confused when people have asked me and my colleagues, how did you know? Like, how has Wired been so ahead of all this? And I was like, we just listened to what he said. He is very transparent about what he wants. I mean, he's not always transparent about the motivation or how it might benefit him, because he is a major government contractor. And I do think that it's fair to be raising questions about how these changes might benefit him. So maybe he's not always 100% transparent about what that might be. But in terms of the actual steps he wants to take and the results he wants to see in terms of how these things function, he is very transparent about it. He's very open. And similarly with Twitter, he came in saying he wanted free speech absolutism. He wanted to restore accounts that had been banned. He wanted to roll back content moderation. He thought the company was, needed to have the fat trimmed in terms of employees. He said all of these things, and, people said, well, he's going to lose advertisers. He's going to lose users. He's going to, people are going to flee the platform. And they said it publicly. I'm sure he heard it. He listens to the news. He has access to the internet. I'm sure he heard all of it. And he said, no, this is my plan. And that is exactly what he did. He came into the company. He cut staff. I think now at this point, Twitter has lost about 80% of the headcount that they had when he purchased it. And for context, like, Twitter as a company is not like Meta or Google. Like, it wasn't a massive lumbering tech company. They actually didn't have a ton of fat to cut, but he did. He rolled back content moderation. He allowed accounts that had been previously banned to be on the platform. He did exactly what he said he was going to do. And they did lose advertisers, and it didn't matter. He continued to float the company. And so I think, the biggest thing that that I have taken away from that is, like, when Elon Musk says he's going to do something, he is going to do it. And he's not like unaware of the consequences of it. He was not unaware that he was at risk of losing advertisers, in the same way that I doubt that if they, do things like cut an absurd amount of federal jobs, that would have an impact on the economy. And he has said very publicly in one of his Twitter spaces in the fall that, like, yes, there will be some pain, cutting $2 trillion from the federal deficit. Yes, there will be pain. Yes, it will be hard. And so like, I think people, when they report on him sort of being like, taking this sort of idea that like he is not informed or he doesn't know what he's doing or he is unaware of like the adverse consequences of some of the decisions he might want to make. I don't think that's a fair representation of him as a decision maker. Like he has thought through these things. He has been very public about how he's thinking about them. And I think that same approach that he had with Twitter is what we're seeing in the federal government, down to the name of the title of the email, which was fork in the road, encouraging people to resign, coming in, doing code reviews, looking for inefficiencies, making people justify their jobs. He's doing the same playbook. And so in that way, it's not surprising. And I think anyone who paid attention to the Twitter meltdown, and very specifically, even ideologically, some of the voices that he was very particularly concerned about bringing back onto Twitter, should not be surprised about the stuff that he's prioritizing in this moment and how he's going about this process.
Yeah, I think that's a really key point in terms of you mentioned him rolling back content moderation policies on Twitter, accounts that were reinstated that had been banned for explicit racism, transphobia. And I think that all really is an important context for what they're trying to do here and what they know the consequences will be. Let's get a little bit into what has happened specifically over the past 3 weeks. Victoria and Lisa, I'd love to start with you because I know you've really been in it on the day-to-day in terms of if you're trying to bring folks up to speed on what Musk and Doge have been doing and the extent of access that they now seem to have. What are the key kind of signposts that you would highlight? Victoria, maybe you first.
I think what we're seeing is a really move fast, break things tech industry approach to this situation. And actually another thing that Musk did with his purchase of Twitter that we're now seeing in the federal government is he brought people from his other companies, people who he trusted, top engineers and executives, to be a part of this. And Steve Davis, who's CEO of the Boring Company and was very involved in the Twitter takeover, is now helping lead Doge. So I think, again, we're seeing all the same strategies that I think Musk has felt were quite successful in his other businesses. So I think anytime we're looking at something and, I think he feels like his takeover and ownership of Twitter was successful, it is what he was hoping it would be. And so if that is a workable sort of model, then that's probably going to be transplanted. So I think the first thing we're seeing is that people with connections to Musk's own companies are popping up as part of Doge, and they are being given high-level access to these government agencies. So at OPM, which is the Office of Personal Management, they were reporting directly to Amanda Scales, who is the new chief of staff, who used to work for XAI. At the GSA, the General Services Administration, some of these people were given what's called A-suite level access, and that's a high level of access. That means you get access to all the physical and IT systems that the agency has. And that's not something that would just sort of be given away willy-nilly. That's something that more senior staff would have. And similarly, with Treasury, our reporting found that the Doge representative for a brief time had read-write access to the code there. And that's also something that would be very unique and probably would require a certain level of seniority and background checking within the organization. I think while Doge has said that recently that some of these people have all been like gone through sort of the privacy briefings and whatever, like the reality is that for these high level roles, oftentimes people would go through background checks. They would have to, spend weeks, if not months, answering questions, putting documentation together to get vetted for that level of data access. And in this case, obviously, it's only been 3 weeks, so it seems unlikely that that was possible. And that's not even getting into the fact that, like, so many of these people who work in these systems, particularly on the IT and technical side, are really well versed in privacy law. They understand like what data they can and cannot share through what systems and why things are set up in a way. And like sometimes systems are set up somewhat inefficiently for protection. You know, if every part of the government shared data and talked to each other, that would mean that you were also really, really vulnerable if any one part of those was compromised. So there is a reason sometimes that things maybe do not work as quote unquote efficiently as they need to. You know, I come from the world of international development before I was a journalist, and every time someone would talk about efficiency, the first question always needs to be efficient for whom? And, you know, there are some reasons why things don't always work as seamlessly as maybe they would at a private company, where fundamentally your user base is smaller, your blast radius of something going wrong is also smaller.
I mean, very amazing summary of what is happening and what we know. I think there's obviously a lot we don't know about what they are seeing and doing on the inside. And part of that is responsive to the move fast, break things description. You know, they on purpose are moving incredibly quickly and making it hard for us to keep up, even as they make workers incredibly uncomfortable and force them out. I think some things are working on the outside to push back. So maybe that's the extra layer I'll frame up for this question, which is they did, do the freeze memo and utterly confuse and confound people across the nation with it. And there was pushback to it because it was, they were too big for their britches. They overreached, and it impacted Republican governors and constituents they hadn't counted on, and just regular people who, suddenly realized that that was the paycheck of the nonprofit worker who lives next door. So I think we were able to change the story quickly of what they were doing, and they did have to pull it back. So I want to frame that up as sort of Doge is not unstoppable, and then say the same about the litigation strategies. There's a lot happening, and I know we'll talk a little bit more about it in a second, but just the way that judges have been responding to just the blatant illegality is comforting. I mean, they are moving fast and doing things that normal governments wouldn't try, and the courts are responding appropriately. So just want to say that as well. I think it's a part of the picture. It's not scaring them off as of yet, but it is showing fractures and cracks in what they're trying to do. And I think we need to keep pushing.
John, I'd also love to give you a chance to chime in if there are any like signposts that have really stood out to you over the last few weeks as just kind of really out of the ordinary, or a sign of where things have been going.
I think Lisa and Victoria have covered the ones that come to mind, but I did want to pick up just on one point about the discussion of efficiency and that rationale being put forward as an explanation for everything that's going on. Don't be fooled. I mean, I don't think anyone listening in here would be fooled, but don't be fooled. Don't be dragged into the trap of arguing about efficiency and fraud detection. This is not what that's not what this is about. This is about control. There are ways to improve efficiency in government. There are ways to identify fraud in government. They involve legislation. They involve regulation. They involve trained personnel and experts, and they involve inspectors general. But we know that all of those have been cut out of the loop by everything that Elon Musk and his associates have been doing the past several weeks. So, keep your eyes on what is really going on, and that is about establishing control over databases and establishing control thereby over federal agencies.
And I'm going to pick up on that thread really quickly before we jump into what's happening more on the court side, which Lisa set us up for. There have been a couple of questions already in terms of what do we know for sure about what has already been accessed and what kind of control has already been gained, in large part thanks to incredible reporting from Victoria and her colleagues. And what kind of are we still looking for answers are, or what's kind of obscured by design here? I'm happy to toss it to anyone who feels ready to jump in on that.
I can start. I mean, I think Vittoria's reporting is has been exceptional here, so I'm eager to hear from her. But the short answer is we don't know with certainty just what systems have been accessed. We know in some cases with certainty, but in other cases we don't know what systems have been accessed by whom, for what purpose, and what have been done to them. We know generally, and I spoke earlier about the Treasury systems at Bureau of Fiscal Service and the Office of Personnel Management, the ARI database, some of the particular payment systems at BFS as well. And we know from reporting that there have been, changes pushed to the code base of some of these systems. And we know that quite broad access, anomalous broad access that seems to blow past all of the segmentation and access controls and training that would normally be in place at these, with respect to these databases and at these agencies, have been bypassed, in ways that, by the way, if you talk to federal IT folks, it's not typically the case for a federal database of any great size that there would be one person who has the master key, and it's just a matter of getting that person's password. These databases are segmented by design, so that there are, a point of failure does not result in the total compromise of the database of the system. And what they're doing in many cases appears to involve, tearing down that segmentation and getting super administrators, super access. So I think we know enough to be quite concerned, and certainly hope to learn more as time goes on through wonderful folks like Vittoria.
Yeah, I think I'll echo that. What we do know, I think the big issue again, when we come back to is transparency. People within these government organizations who are able to access these systems or would otherwise be senior level people, down to regular people, employees at these offices, it doesn't seem like any of them really have a sense of what's being accessed and for what purpose. And that is particularly concerning. I want to credit Josh Marshall with Talking Points memo. He also covered Treasury stuff and did seem to also find that the Doge person was making changes to the code, that that person did have read-write access. So there's also other great people doing work out there. But I think, the biggest issue is that we don't know. And it's one thing for me and you not to know, that's fine. I don't need to, we are regular citizens. We're not supposed to know who has the keys to everything. But it's the fact that the career civil servants who have, past background checks, who are, qualified on levels set with standards set sort of down through their agencies, also don't really know what's going on. That is particularly concerning.
And I think that goes to the core of some of the lawsuits that have already been fired as well, and particularly on the side of employees of these agencies, both who are kind of targets in terms of some of this data access because they have data in these systems that we do not have, for example, like at the Office of Personnel Management, and also because they're being targeted in a lot of ways as they're trying to hold the line on some of these security issues. So Lisa, I'd like to kick it to you first to bring us up to speed on how people are fighting back on the legal side of things. There's obviously been a lot of protests here in DC that have been organized. Congress has been flooded with calls, and groups like Public Citizen really mobilized on day one and have continued to mobilize as these events have developed. So could you talk just a bit about how your lawsuits came about and then what arguments you've been making in front of the courts?
Absolutely. So 3 categories of our Doge legal work. As I mentioned at the top, we sued right off the bat on the overall structure of Doge. We thought it was potentially a illegal federal advisory committee. We've since filed suit, the second category, on specific agencies where Doge is infiltrating and accessing data. And then a third category is where extreme actions are being caused by DOJ, like the dissolution of USAID, CFPB, et cetera. So just to share a bit more about our Treasury suit in particular, since we've talked a lot about that today. So we sued the department along with States Defending Democracy Fund on behalf of the Alliance for Retired Americans, AFGE and SEIU, about sharing confidential data with Elon Musk and DOJ, and just demanding an immediate end to the systemic, continuous, ongoing violation of federal laws that protect all our privacy. This is really clear law. Our federal records have personal information in them. They're protected under the Privacy Act of 1974. The tax components are protected under IRS rules. We've talked at length about the whys for this, so I won't go into further detail there, but obviously that information is incredibly important and needs to be protected. Last Wednesday, we appeared before a federal judge and argued for a temporary restraining order to block Musk and DOJ from accessing the Treasury Department information. Thursday, the judge issued an order preventing DOJ employees from accessing that information, with the exception of two persons, two Musk-connected people who are working in Treasury. So they're actually SGEs, special governmental employees as a part of Treasury, but they would have read-only access. Since then, one of them has resigned over a found out white nationalist social media account. So it's just one. Flagging that the state's attorneys general, a big group of them, had a similar suit right after ours. So they got a even more complete temporary block in place, so covers the waters. So this is a really important step to, of course, protect the privacy of tens of millions of Americans. The next step is a hearing for the full preliminary injunction, which will come on the 24th. And, if we're successful, it means that they will no longer have access, but also that all information that they've shared will be taken back. So that's a piece of this, which is really important too, particularly because of discussions of sort of AI crawling around, and we want to make sure that things come back to the agency. So the suits, they're critically important, huge part of our strategy. Just want to say one thing about how they play together with the protests you mentioned, Jenna, and the sort of overall reaction that people are having to these affronts. So right now, the idea of Musk having access to our data is hugely unpopular. He is underwater personally, and this is a big piece of it. I mentioned our polling earlier, so just want to say one more word about it. That piece is very unpopular, and also the idea of Musk having too much influence and involvement, and also his conflicts of interest is also, hugely problematic to people. Voters have indicated that's, their top concern, saying that roughly 61% think it is unfavorable that there are no rules that prevent the conflicts of interest by Elon Musk, even though his wealth and business interests are directly impacted by the federal government's actions. So, this is something that is really hitting a chord with folks across parties, across the nation. So just want to say that as well, that I think it fits together. The legal actions have to happen. They have to happen quickly because of the human harms. But we also need to message this and talk about it. And I think understanding that corruption and conflicts of interest, as well as the excessive role of Musk, are the things that we should be talking about is important.
That's great. John, I don't know if you want to hop in here kind of on some of the privacy law concerns in particular. I think it was Victoria who raised that a lot of the career civil servants who are normally overseeing these systems have a lot of background in the protections that are supposed to exist. And so not having them at the helm really raises concerns more broadly about what the people handling this even know about what they should be caring about, our data protection and data rights, regardless of whether they would care about it anyway. So curious if you had any thoughts on that piece.
Yeah, I mean, I think often when we're thinking about violations of privacy safeguards and information security safeguards in government, it is, failure to comply with one or a handful of particular restrictions, and you're looking at exactly how the failure came to pass. There are competent people involved in the administration of these systems. They have been trained. They may have been inadequately diligent in designing or carrying out certain protections. But here we have a scenario where there is a deliberate disregard for what federal law requires in the form of privacy protection, information security protection, confidentiality protection, et cetera. And it's a very different scenario on a very different scale than anything that's come before. I will say we have been here in a sense in that the Privacy Act of 1974 and many of the information security safeguards that have come since are in one form or another a reaction to the Watergate era and the abuses, presidential abuses of power from that time, and wrongful misuse and access of records held in government systems. But we're dealing with something on another scale here. And as I said at the top, and others have said, this is the largest data breach and most consequential data breach in US history.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing that I have found most surprising is, being a tech reporter who has, covered things like the TikTok ban, the absolute concern around Americans' data that was posed by a social media app that doesn't even gather your social security number, doesn't have my bank account number unless you're a creator who's maybe making money off the app, like the fact that there seemed to be so much public fear and consternation about whether or not TikTok was a safe product for American consumers to be using. I think that it is only reasonable that if we have those kinds of questions about a foreign-made social media app, that we should have similar questions about a non-transparent initiative within government.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and truly highlights the lack of legal safeguards we have writ large in terms of our personal data, which I know most of our folks here could talk about at length and has been kind of a long battle in the policy space. But to John's point, I think we're dealing with a context where people aren't abiding by the legal bounds that already do exist. We're getting a number of questions about how folks can be involved, in particular in the legal context and also more broadly. I was wondering, Lisa, if you could speak a little bit about who you've partnered with in your suits and kind of who initially has had standing in these cases to bring challenges against DOJ's actions.
Yeah, it needs to be entities or individuals who are directly impacted and harmed by the changes that we're seeing or the shutdown of agencies wholesale. So there have been suits that have represented employees, which get to that last point. We also, when we sued on USAID, we were thinking about the constitutionality of the issue, the idea that there should be separation of powers, and who is impacted by the agency no longer being in existence. So again, it was sort of groupings of persons that, in this case, a collective of foreign service workers that we represented. So it's very different in each case. So I can't run through them all. We've been suing up a storm, but I will just say that that's the crux of it. Like, who is harmed? And it can't be sort of nebulous harm. Like, you're a consumer and you might one day access the CFPB's database. It has to be like you were using something that the CFPB provided day in, day out. And so you are actually changed by something coming down or the agency not being hard at work or that kind of thing. That's the way to think about it.
We're also kind of on that vein getting a lot of questions about what everyone's mentioned, but Lisa, you spoke to in your polling about just the lack of popularity that Musk has and the degree of dissatisfaction that we're seeing. I mentioned at the top that Congress is seeing a record number of calls, but I think people have a broad sense that maybe they're not getting through or they're not being heard or they want to take more concrete action. And we have a couple of questions just broadly about how we can take this information and better message it to people. I'd be curious to hear all of your thoughts, including like Victoria, to the extent that you've been able to kind of understand the response to your reporting as people have gotten more information, and kind of what you're seeing as next steps for folks to be involved and stay involved, and also help inform their communities about what's going on.
Well, I still advocate for a small recording of John just telling people everything that the Treasury has, every piece of data the Treasury has. I think it's really hard because there's so much happening. And it's really, really hard for someone who is, I think the biggest thing, I'm trying to think. I think the biggest thing is that when systems work well, we don't even clock that they're there. And the only time we clock that a system exists is when it's not working well. So I guarantee that like everyone on this call could name a time where they've had to deal with a hospital and a bad health insurance company. Maybe they had to negotiate Medicare or Medicaid or supplemental insurance, and they could tell you every single thing wrong with that system because they've had to interact with a system that is not working for them. But if they've gotten their tax return on time-ish every year since they started filing taxes, they probably don't think very much about that system. They assume it's going to keep working. And so I think the hardest thing is that we're telling people that something that they don't even realize could be taken away from them is under threat, or that something that they don't even think of as really existing is going to change. And, a really sort of key moment for this, I was talking to a friend of mine and we were talking about the USAID closures. And I said, well, if they close, they're going to like leave all these workers stranded in all these other parts of the world. And she was like, well, won't the government just evacuate them? And I was like, well, she was like, won't they just get evacuated? And I said, who's going to evacuate them? And I think it's that type of thing where it's like, people are used to these systems working. They're used to protocols being fulfilled. They're used to norms generally holding. And I think a thing that, as a reporter, I've had to really, that it's been hard to communicate, particularly because there isn't a lot of transparency and we don't really know, is like how this might end up feeling to people. I think we've seen it with people who like had federal jobs or were relying on federal funding, and maybe those offers have been rescinded, or those jobs are like not going to be able to come through, or that research isn't going to get funded. And that is a real consequence. But I think because we're still in the early stages, the idea of explaining to people the way in which systems that they have had function pretty well their whole lives and don't even think about may fall apart is a hard challenge. And it's also speculative, right? Because we are only going to see the impacts of this over the coming weeks and months.
Very well said. I will, picking up on a couple of those points, just add, continuing to make the implications and effects of this as concrete as possible for members of the public, making it clear that even if it hasn't happened yet today, we're talking about a sequence of events that has made it possible for someone with a conflict of interest, doesn't even really capture what it is, but someone with a systemic hostility towards government and government services, gaining access to data and systems that would allow him, if he so chose, to deny you Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, other licenses and benefits on the basis of your political views. And that's terrifying, and it should be. And I think we should take seriously what Lisa was saying public citizen has detected through its polling and others have detected, which is that there is broad public dislike for Musk and the things that he and his associates are doing. And we should continue to find ways to leverage that. Something this broad and daunting in scope is not generally going to be defeated by a single heroic action. It's going to require many small, sometimes unsatisfying actions by a lot of different people in a lot of different places. And I think this assault on democracy is vulnerable to that. I think one of the things that stands out to me, and I think Lisa alluded to this earlier, is just how many ways they've screwed up in this process, how many vulnerabilities they have left themselves open to. They've aggravated a lot of stakeholders. They're in the process of aggravating the courts. They have embarrassed themselves in many ways. They've drawn the ire of the public. And I think in many ways they have already sown the seeds of their downfall, even if that's not apparent yet, even if the situation seems quite bleak at the moment. And that is not a call to be naive about the scale of the threats here, but it is a call not to give in to despair and to remember that there is power in opposing these things collectively.
Just a +1. I agree with that last point a lot. And I think that people have been engaging in really important ways, pushing out the human impacts that they're seeing. Like story banks are really important right now, like to both John and Victoria's points. There are real people who are being impacted, real jobs on the line, real grants that are frozen, real research that's not happening at universities that can save still more lives. I think that like those kinds of points matter a lot, coupled with talking about the corruption. And I think, people across the country can help us collect those stories and share them, create the echo chamber that we need about what's really happening and what the impacts are. And then I think there are productive places to channel those stories and also outrage and work. There have been some really effective sort of engagements and protests, and people are sort of, ginning up for the next phase of resistance in a really real way, which is meaningful. And there are some places where we can win things. For example, the budget fight that will happen in Congress is directly connected to everything that they're trying to do through executive order. They are going to try to cut the rest of the $2 trillion that DOJ promised there. And Congress does have the power of the purse, notwithstanding them trying to avoid that through what they've been doing. And so I think there's a battle to be had where everyone's senators and members matter. And so just knowing that and knowing that there are places for constituents to weigh in, I think hopefully changes the calculus a little bit when folks are feeling like there's nothing to do.
Thank you for those answers. I really appreciate them, both as a former member of the media and also as an organizer. John, your point about small and maybe in the moment seemingly not impactful or not particularly satisfying actions still add up, particularly when we're doing them in community and we're doing them repeatedly. I wanted to flag one more question before I have one question to wrap us up with, but I thought that this would be a good one for Victoria and Lisa, especially, and John, anything you wanted to add, of course. Folks are asking kind of about this nebulous structure of DOJ and what we do or don't know about some of these people working underneath Musk, about Musk's own status as a special government employee, and how, well, first of all, what we know, and then how that affects what their obligations are, what their legal vulnerabilities may be, and what kind of the next steps might be in terms of accountability.
Yeah, I can start and then everyone else can hop on. So I think a thing that is not super well explained is that there's actually two DOJs. There's the repurposed US Digital Service, that's now the US DOJ Service. And then underneath that, there is a temporary organization called DOJ, also DOJ. And when something is a temporary organization, and that's the one that ends on July 4th, 2026, when something's a temporary organization, they can hire what are called special government employees, which are people that come in for 130 days. So that's like generally 6 months, 5 days a week working. And they can come in as volunteers or as like temporary employees, and they're not subject to the same levels of transparency and requirements as a regular government employee is. And once they've done their 6 months, they can leave and go back to the private sector. And I think when we're talking about possible conflicts of interest, the the fact that so many people who are a part of the Doge effort are coming from Musk's companies, coming from Palantir, which is run by Peter Thiel, another billionaire who's close with Musk. I think that's an important thing to, acknowledge, that like these people are coming in, they're not necessarily being required to like give up those jobs. They're taking leave of absences, or maybe they will leave those jobs and they'll get sort of all this really valuable information working for the government and someone else will hire them. But I think that's an important thing to note, that like they are not coming in as permanent government employees, and that means they're not subject to the same level of transparency. And if your ultimate end is going to be moving directly right back to the private sector, specifically to a government contractor, the information that they can glean in the time that they're with Doge might be very, very important.
You said it perfectly. I guess the only other thing I would say is if special government employees are not drawing a salary, then like there's even less transparency and conflict of interest disclosure requirements. So there's some confusion about whether Musk is actually being paid and whether anybody's being paid, and that is a piece of it. Whether how they've made it still murkier. Yeah, I think part of the reason that we filed our initial suit about whether they're an illegal federal advisory committee is because some of this murkiness, there's sort of an inside government, outside government partnership. There are recommendations being made. There are some SGEs. There are some people just giving advice. The definition of a federal advisory committee is exactly that. Yeah, that it has to, that it's making recs, and some of it is outside. So definitely the entity itself is nefarious, and the way people are interacting with government just leaves us with a ton of questions. And as Victoria keeps saying, not enough transparency to dig into all the conflicts of interest that there are. We know a bunch of it because it's publicly reported, but there's probably a lot we don't know.
I will add very quickly that because of some eccentric case law and aspects of statutes like the Administrative Procedure Act and the Freedom of Information Act, often units of government that are very close to the president are shielded from the causes of action out of those statutes and the accountability they bring, unless and until they exercise what's called substantial independent authority. And I think it is beyond serious doubt that at this point, the Doge, the element of this that exists as part of the U.S. Digital Service fits that description. And I think they're going to come to regret that they have sort of walked backwards into constituting an agency, because that's going to bring with it, additional levers of litigation and responsibility on the Doge and the people who work for it.
All right, well, we are right at 3 p.m. I want to just really quickly get all of your read on my last question, which is, in terms of what comes next, what are you all going to be looking for and paying attention to, and what should folks be keeping their eyes on in the coming days and weeks?
Well, I'll kick it off and just say, keep your ears open for more suits. We are aggressively suing everywhere we can, so hope to have more to share on that front soon. Also just more public engagements, sort of coupling legal action with protest and social media and discussion of the themes that we've talked about today. And then I think lastly, really starting to tie together the executive actions to the upcoming budget fight and reconciliation fight, where they will try to do things like cut taxes for the richest among us, and just explaining how it all hangs together, and hoping everyone on the call today can help us do all of that.
Well said. I'll add, keep an eye out for the wins, because they're going to come. They've already come in some forms, and they're going to keep coming. And it is significant when a court orders a federal agency to stop doing a thing that it's doing. And that is only possible through the hard work of litigants and attorneys like Lisa and her colleagues and the organizations they represent. I think those are going to be important for staying grounded through what is going to be a very long and difficult fight. So I encourage everyone to celebrate the wins when they come.
I will let you know if I have an idea of what comes next. We're just still chasing the whole time.
I was gonna say, to that point, I think everybody who's watching should at a minimum be following Victoria's reporting and subscribe to Wired and follow other journalists who are really on this beat in this moment. From Free Press, we'll be following up from this webinar with a recording and also our additional work. And again, the work that Public Citizen and Epic and other groups in this moment is doing is so critical. So continue lending your support to them, following on their social media and website, and staying up to date with everything that's going on. Thank you so much to our panelists. This has been really incredible. And thank you to everyone who joined.
Thank you, Jenna.
Thanks.